So we'll give a couple of minutes for everybody else to join in. Javier, you're going to share your screen, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go through our logistics slides first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Macy. My apologies, Macy, who will do the introductions of our two speakers. And then she and you will coordinate on who turns the screen over, and then Julia will be the second speaker. So that will be our sort of order for today. So I've got about 5 slides that I'll go through first, so just so you're aware.
Sure.
And I don't know if Sarah W is on, if you want to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready, or I'm not going to put everybody in. Good evening to Darby. Oh, there we go. I'll give a couple minutes for people to join in. So for those that you don't know, we're in the state of Colorado. We've had some massive wildfires, and Julia, who's one of our speakers, is living quite close to one of the wildfires. It's the largest wildfire in our history. It's less than 5 miles outside of our town. So things have been slightly crazy on this side, with a lot of smoke and a lot of people getting evacuated from this local area. But the temperatures dropped today, so hopefully the firefighters will get the wildfires under control in the next couple of days. I think it's about 40% contained right now, so it's still going, which is pretty late in our fire season. So as everybody else sort of joins in, and hi to Pam, good to see you again. We missed you the other day. It looks like Andrew's up with his evening dinner or the like. I'm going to go through, as usual, some logistics slides, and then we will have our two speakers for today, which we're excited to host. So Sarah, let's go on to the next slide. And always a reminder that we do have these videos, and thanks to Amna for storing the videos. So if you miss one of the guest speakers, that there we always keep an archive of those speakers, and those videos are relatively easy to watch. So as people are getting joined in, the usual reminders: number one, please rename yourself on your screen, so you can include the abbreviation for your institution, so the guest speakers can see who is from what institution. So for example, Gillian should be, if I rename myself, it'll be Gillian at CSU for Colorado State University. So second, will be moderated by one of our SDG teams. Macy will lead the conversation with her team when they call on you to ask your question. If you are able to turn on your video to do a quick waves to the speakers, that would be awesome. If you can't, that's okay as well. To introduce yourself with your name of your institution and its location, where it's at, that'd be useful. Again, we're from all over the world, and welcome. See some waving faces. Also, please do remember to mute yourself, so Amna doesn't have to be the evil moderator and mute everybody, but that she does have the control to do. But I also wanted to just remind you, let's try and get used to using Twitter. When we get towards the global conference, we are anticipating actually a great number of students. We have a couple of the classes that will be joining us for that global conference. So we've asked each of the SDG teams to set up a Twitter account, and we'll have Sarah put the hashtags in the chat box, or Amna can, to make sure to remind people to use the Twitter or use the hashtag to generate some questions, but to try and get us used to using that, so by the time we get to the global conference, everybody is prepared. So next slide, I will put the Twitter handle up in the chat box. So quick reminder that, and thank you all to many of the teams. I think 4 teams are fully registered right now. There are a couple of SDG teams that still need to get registered for the conference. To please get your abstract submissions together. That means for the SDG teams, you need to narrow down which targets you're working on, what your case handle is. I guess the Twitter hashtag is in the chat box now. And also to submit the registration. For some students on this team, you will notice that when we do the registration that we are asking people to do 2 surveys, and we're going to ask that you do repeat those surveys. One is the climate action survey, if you have not done it before. If you're students who have done it, we're asking you just to do the survey at the beginning and the end of the class. So we'll make sure to have clear instructions on that. And please do get your registration, even if your team is not quite ready. Everybody needs to register, not just the team. Every individual does need to register. Next slide. Yes, we can put those links in the chat box from Emily. Okay, so also here's the poster, which has been posted in our notes, and also you'll see that there are 2 QR codes, so you can actually hit the Q code with your camera and get directly to the registration link. Okay, next slide. And thanks again to University of Derby and Andrew's team, who is the main host for the conference. So a couple of reminders. I mean, this is a pilot year for this project. We're looking forward to the continuing year. So please do the climate action survey if you have not done so yet. Andrew, it would be awesome if you could remind your students to do the climate action survey. And also for all those who are on teams, we do the reflective journaling each week. So if you could actually remind it with your Yay Fellows will remind you to do that each week. And part of what we're looking is the journey that we're all through as a multi-institutional project. So we want to see what people are thinking each week. So just be reminded of that. And those 2 links are also up, and we can add those to the chat box. And thank you, Andrew, for reminding the Derby students. Next slide. So just a reminder, so our guest speaker schedule. This week we have Javier, who I have the great pleasure of having worked with for many years, another Fulbright fellow. So we've got several Fulbright scholars, and Amna is also a Fulbright scholar. So welcome to the Fulbright family. And you'll get a full introduction of Javier. And Julia Klein, who's a colleague here at Colorado State University. And all of us have actually worked in Huascarán National Park, which is one of the highest mountains in Peru. So I'm sure you'll hear more about that, and feel free to ask any of us questions about this exciting project, which is in year 5. And the following week, we have one of my wonderful friends and colleagues, Brandy Wilson. We'll introduce her slide in a second. She will be hosted by SCG 1617. And then yet another colleague from Georgia State University, Stefan Moss, will talk about a project in the Bahamas. Laura Grismer, who is a U.S. Foreign Service officer, will follow on November 11th. She was the head of mission for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. She's also an instructor now for the National Defense Institute. So she will share a lot with SDG 4, educating about international issues from the perspective of a Foreign Service officer and the U.S. State Department. And then November 18th, Leanne and Alice Madden, who are both lawyers. One is from Leanne, who's a PI on this project from Vanderbilt. Alice is from University of Colorado Boulder, right down the road from us, law school. And she's the head of the environmental law school within the bigger law school. November 25th is Thanksgiving, no class, and we're still working on a speaker for December 2nd. And then again, December 9th is a virtual conference. And that will be sort of our closeout for many of the classes. So next slide. Sarah W., do you want to talk through this slide real quick?
Yeah, sure, I can briefly touch on this. This was just an update as to how we hope the SCG teams, or what type of work we hope you're able to achieve over the next few weeks. So this week, ideally would like to have about half of the research of your project completed by Friday. Please communicate with your SDG fellow to make sure that you're making steady progress with your project. Also, as a reminder, if you haven't completed the abstract submission form or the registration for the Global Virtual Conference, please do this as soon as you can. That way we can start to put you all on a schedule for the conference so you know what time you'll present. Following week, would like to have your primary research completed so you can start to transition to organizing your project for the conference. By the 6th of November, about a fourth of your presentation complete. we'd like a rough draft of your project to share to class on the 11th of November, and then share to Slack by the 13th. So just keep those deadlines in mind. We will do a rough draft presentation on Zoom as a group on the 18th of November during breakout rooms, so just be prepared for that. And then, yeah, I mean, just preparing for the virtual conference, being comfortable with your presentation, recording audio if you plan to do so, making sure you're all comfortable with the roles that you have for that presentation. The week prior to the conference is the goal for those teams. So we'll continue to update this schedule every week. If you have questions about these deadlines, please reach out to your fellow or myself through Slack.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's go on to the next slide. I see, Macy, you're about ready to go. So next week, I just wanted to remind you all, SDG 1617 will be hosting. Brandy Wilson is Sustainability Director for Simplot, and she's excited to get some questions from you guys. I just sort of thought I'd like to highlight this because here's our quiz question. Which country has the most variety of potatoes in the world? And sort of a hint, Javier can't answer that question. But it is sort of interesting. Did anyone put it in the chat box? Does anyone actually know what that country is? Yay, Paula. Yeah, Peru has the largest variety of indigenous potatoes. Some amazing variety of potatoes in the world. But Brandy runs Simplot, which is the largest potato company in the world. They also one of the largest avocado producers in the world. So just sort of a fun. Peru invented potatoes. It's a fun sort of fun chance to actually hear from the industry as to what they think about sustainability development. And Brandy has worked with us for many years, so feel free to throw a lot of questions at her. They do everything from this. It's a huge company, from GMOs to pesticides, etc. And she's happy to take all of those questions. She's really wonderful. And so the next slide, I think I now turn this over to Macy. I think the next slide is yours. So Macy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So SDG 13 is very excited to host the guest lectures for today. So just to give you a little bit of a timeline, we're going to start with the presentation by Dr. Naupari, and then move to Dr. Klein's presentation. And then after both presentations, we'll have our questions and our discussions. And then we will stop at around 4 so that we can have time for our breakout rooms. So first, I will introduce our guest lectures. Okay, starting with Dr. Javier Naupari. He's a professor in rangeland ecology and management and researcher of the Rangeland Ecology Laboratory at Universidad Nacional Agraria La Molina. Dr. Naupari, a Fulbright alumnus, received his PhD degree in natural resources at the University of Idaho and an MS degree in range animal production at La Molina University. In 2012, he received a Fulbright Nexus Award for collaborative research by mid-career professionals that open new avenues of collaboration with Colorado State University, Texas A&M, and other American higher education institutes. His research area is remote sensing and geographic information systems applied to ecological processes in mountain rangeland ecosystems, such as the ecological status and productivity of rangeland ecosystems and the impact of climate change on livestock production. He is currently the director of the International Office at La Molina University. And Dr. Julia Klein is a professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability and a research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. She received a BA in political science from Cornell University and an MS and PhD in ecosystem science from the University of California at Berkeley. Upon receiving her doctorate, she was awarded a NOAA postdoctoral climate and global change fellowship. The broad goals of Dr. Klein's research are to understand how interacting global changes affect pastoral and mountain ecosystems and livelihoods, to detect the patterns and underlying mechanisms driving these responses and feedbacks, and to identify actions and pathways to increase adaptation opportunities to global change. Her projects typically combine diverse methods, including experimental manipulations, landscape analysis, local ecological knowledge, and modeling. The main geographic focus of her research has been the eastern and central alpine grasslands of the Tibetan Plateau. However, she also works on the shortgrass steppe and alpine region of Colorado and conducts global synthesis of grassland, Arctic, alpine, and mountain systems worldwide. Dr. Klein is lead PI of the Mountain Sentinels Collaborative Network, an interactive research coordination network composed of transdisciplinary, globally representative teams of mountain scientists and stakeholders using biophysical and socioeconomic observations and models to engage in knowledge co-creation and coordinated practice for mountain sustainability. She is also working on a documentary film focused on a small and dedicated group of people in the Peruvian Andes grappling with the severe and imminent effects of climate change. So we are very excited to have them both here talking to us today. Sarah, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and then Javier can begin sharing his screen and we'll get started.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, Nancy, for the introduction. Well, I'm very happy to share some of our research that we have done in the Rangeland Ecology and Utilization Lab at La Molina University. Today we are going to introduce you to part of the Andean rangelands and some of the studies that we have conducted regarding vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. Well, this is a map of Peru, where you can see what we call the Puna region. This Puna region is it's an area or an ecoregion that is above 3,800 meters above sea level, around 12,000 feet. And there's a mix of vegetation types. This area covers around 22 million hectares, and it has like 14 million hectares of grazing land. Around 60% of this area is also is a mountainous area, and it's we have the main mines in this area. So, and you can see here a part of the vegetation that covers the area is mostly tuso grasslands, but there are other areas like these mountain wetlands, or what we call here bofedales, and that's part of the project that we are working with Gillian and other folks from Michigan Technical University and Texas Housing and the Mountain Institute. And in southern Peru, the conditions of the Puna area is much drier. It's covered mostly by these shrubs that we call tolares, and it's similar to the Artemisia that you have in the western US. So, and I will come back with this because this is a part of the story I'm going to tell you. Well, in this area is very important for our economy. As I said, is mainly this area. There are mainly two activities: mining and livestock. But from our perspective as animal scientist and rangeland management and science researcher, this area is very important for food security. As you can see here, most of the production of cattle, sheep, and mainly and alpacas too, contribute to meat, in around 46% of the national consumption, and milk from cattle, mainly around 23.8%. So this is very important area because around 80% of the livestock industry, let's say, or husbandry is conducted in this area, no? And if we would have the correct channels, no, for feeding children, no, we can cover protein or for children are in between 7 months to 3 years, no. But there's another story there. It's more social, no, because there's high rates of malnutrition, no, of children. And well, this area is very important from food security and also for the economics, but unfortunately has been degraded, no, and there's a vulnerability to climate change, no. So this is part of a study that we've done with some funding from the World Bank for the Central Highlands of Peru. And we use remote sensing with satellites like Sentinel and Landsat, no, to estimate degradation in this area. No? And you can see that more than 50% no, of this area is in poor and very poor status. No? There's only almost 0% of this is in very good shape, no? And so you can see that if we extrapolate this to the whole Puna area, then we can see these numbers here, no? For example, from the 14, almost 15 million hectares that we have in the Puna area for grazing land, we can see that there's only these numbers of excellent or very good condition, no, 0.5%, no, and around 18% or 19% of rangeland that are in good condition, like this one, no, that has good coverage of grasses, for example, with there are tall grasses and well managed, and most of them are between regular and in poor condition. And we expect, by 2070, that these numbers may increase, no? And this is because of well, there's no a good management, no? Mostly because the structure and function of these ecosystems are not well understood, no? And in addition, just recently, for example, there's a policy for recover these areas, no? But if those actions are not concluded, then we will have an increment of poor condition rangelands, and that represents a loss of around 56 tons of meat, and that is in US dollars, that could be minus $2 million, no? Oh no, it's not just EU unit, it's not dollars, it's number of animals, no? It's, sorry for the mistake, it's U units, so like sheep units, no? Number of animals, no? So that's so that we cannot have. But in addition, we have this other study regarding climate change vulnerability. So this area is mostly has a high vulnerability to extreme vulnerability to climate change. And one thing is the higher elevation where we have these ecosystems, no? And then there's changes of precipitation, no, pattern, no, mostly in the area. And the other thing is the poverty. Most of the people that live here has a poverty status. So what are the climate change impacts in a recent study? Well, basically, relative recent, in 2014, we made we were part of a study for estimate the climate change impacts on the economy of Peru, and we were in charge of the climate change impacts in livestock. So we, as I mentioned, 80% of livestock is in the Puna area. So we conducted this research for the whole Puna. And you can see that there's some changes here in the colors, no? For example, these Tuso grasslands that right now actually covers 15.4 million hectares, that may be reduced to 4.6 million hectares. No? This is related to the global models of climate. No? So based on those variations, no, we estimate, or we think that by 2100 there will be these changes, and that the shrublands that I show you at the beginning, no, could increase from 2.8 million hectares to 7.1 million hectares. And what does mean those vegetation changes? That so this we have the shrublands that would increase, no? Tuso grasslands or pajonales that will decrease, and also bofedales or the mountain wetlands that also will decrease, like half, no, probably of that. So that means that the carrying capacity of these ecosystems will basically drop, no? And with that, no, that will be also a loss on units, no, and less carcass or meat, and net and a drop in net total profit of the communities in the area, no. So right now we have this rangeland degraded condition, but if we add to that the climate change effects, then we will have a drop in the carrying capacity, and consequently to a loss in the net total profit. So what are some of the strategies that we propose, and these are also some of them have been considered by the Ministry of Environment, that is in charge of climate change action, and there's a law, a frame law for climate change that was published in 2 years ago in Peru. So this is part of these are related to the adaptive capacity development, like promote participative research based on agreements with the communities that live in the area, design rangeland sustainable plans, training people, and have an extension program to better management of rangeland and livestock, the characterization of production systems, and develop models to predict response to climate change. And the technologies, for example, pastures and livestock breeding, that I have some questions there, but I can answer them later. And then the identification of native plants resistant to drought and extreme temperatures, and the development of early warning systems and decision support systems. And then this is also very important, the organization and policies, no, for to promote, no, a better management of rangelands, no, and the participation of the public institutions at the regional, national, regional, and local government. Finally, well, these are some perspectives that we are working since 2012 through the Fuller Nexus, and then with other institutions. We have been working on conceptual model to assess ecosystem and Puna herders vulnerability. We're working now with Texas A&M, North Carolina University at Wilmington, and the USDA ARS in Jornada, New Mexico, a mobile app and knowledge base to support rangeland early warning systems. And with Gillian, and so Gillian is, see her there, but this is the group that work with Colorado State and the Andes Bofedales and cattle for the couple of human natural changes in a traditional livelihood and land management system in the high Andes. With that, I finish, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naupari. That was a very good presentation And I see that we have some questions about it, but we will move to the next presentation by Dr. Klein. And then after that, we will move to the discussion on both presentations. So Dr. Klein, go ahead and take it away.
Julia, make sure to unmute yourself.
Ha, classic. I was talking about for a minute or so. Julia Klein, CSU, really appreciate Dr. Naupari's presentation. And so I'm going to kind of take a bigger picture approach to mountains. And what I'd like you to do during my presentation, I'm not going to mention specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, but I'd like you to kind of really pay attention to how many times my presentation really touches on relevant issues there. So, oops, oh, you know what? Okay. So I just wanted to mention that here I am in Colorado. If you can see in my screen behind me, I live in the Rockies and the foothills here, and we've got some big fires going on behind me. So this is a picture that we took just from our front porch recently, the biggest wildfire in Colorado. And I've always been a big mountain person. It's where I met my husband kayaking there, and this is my son right now taking his first steps on the Tibetan Plateau, where I've done a lot of climate change research. But mountains aren't just really important to me in my life, but mountains from a global perspective, we saw how important it is in the high Andes for food, for milk and meat. But mountains, they cover 25% of the land surface. They're home to 10% of the world's population, yet 50% of the world's population depends on the mountains for different resources or ecosystem services. For example, mountains provide about 60 to 80% of the world's freshwater resources. So I, back in 2012, got some funding to work with academics from mountains all over the world. And we wanted to understand from like a top-down perspective. I think of it as like a bird's eye view. Like, what are some of the big challenges facing mountains across the globe? And what are some of the benefits that society receives from the mountains? Or what are the ecosystem services that these systems provide? And so instead of starting with a site and extrapolating to the world, we wanted to say, what are some commonalities across mountains globally? And so we came together as a group and we came up with a bunch of ideas about mountains. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I'll say we came up with a few features or characteristics of mountains. They tend to be complex from a biophysical point of view. They're subject to hazards like avalanches and wildfires and earthquakes. They tend to be relatively isolated, and the people there tend to be marginalized politically or economically often, not always, of course. And they tend to deliver ecosystem services across scales, so from local to regional to global scales. There are different pressures facing mountains, what we call presses and pulses. And then we also talked about some, we called them paradoxes or sort of contradictions in mountains that challenges their sustainability. For example, they tend to be rich in resources, but from a global perspective, people tend to be income poor. Policies for the mountains tend to be made by those living outside the mountains. Even though mountain people and environments are remote, they're very vulnerable to global environmental change. Some mountains people move in, some move out. They're remote, but they attract diverse actors. People go to mountains for different reasons. And because they're very heterogeneous, we need a lot of data about mountains, but we don't have a lot of that data because they're hard to get to and for various reasons. And so this was sort of what we thought about mountains as a group, but then we actually wanted to go and find out, really, is that the case for mountains globally. So we did a survey of 57 cases around the mountains around the world. So all those purple areas represent mountains, and the triangles represent our study points. And just to summarize quickly, we did find that the most important paradox across all of those 57 sites worldwide was that policies affecting mountains are made by those living outside the mountains. So when you think about sort of UN Sustainable Development Goals and the policy arena, who's making the policy for the mountains? That's a really big question. In terms of the ecosystem services that were most important across all those 57 sites, we found that water and tourism were most important. But we did find differences when we compared sites from countries that we consider more subsistence oriented, or you may say more developing world, versus those that are more market oriented or developed world. For example, those in more of the subsistence oriented landscapes were more isolated mountains than those in the more market oriented world. Sorry. And other things, like in terms of the key drivers or challenges facing different mountains, for example, in market-oriented regions of the world, wildfires were a big driver, but less so in the more of the subsistence-oriented countries. In the subsistence-oriented sites, things like biodiversity loss and resource extraction were more important. So there were differences depending on how you looked at these mountains. And there were a lot more ecosystem services that appeared to be more important in the subsistence-oriented systems in mountains: food, forage, non-timber forest products, medicines, etc. We also looked at these those 57 sites in terms of their primary land use and found some differences. For example, land tenure changes were big changes occurring in pastoral and agro-pastoral systems, whether land was owned by individuals or it was managed more communally. We had in-migration occurring in some mountain land uses and out-migration happening in others. And then in terms of ecosystem services provided, we found that food and forage were really important in the pastoral and the agro-pastoral and the agricultural land uses. And so based on that kind of initial workshop, we applied for some funding and we got money from the National Science Foundation and started what we call the Mountain Sentinels Network. And so we have these goals of just expanding our network to include biophysical and social scientists and different stakeholders. So non-academics, people, community members, students. We're looking at trying to understand the future of mountains, and we're promoting an approach we call science with society. We also have a goal to elevate diverse mountain voices. So I'll just show you a little more work that we've done. We've been doing a lot, but one thing one of a postdoc did was she looked at all of the literature where there were mountain people had talked about the kind of future that they wanted to see. And you can see these dots all over the mountain world, dominated, of course, by work done in Europe, because there's a lot of work being done in Europe. And we were able to identify some of the different futures that people in these mountains wanted to see. And I can't go into the details now, but sort of a next step is, well, if we know the future, what are the different ways to achieve those futures? When we talk about our approach of science with society, we held a workshop in France where we brought one researcher and one stakeholder from a mountain region around the world. Not everyone's in the picture, but my colleague Sechi Dorje, for example, was there from Tibet. Oh, there he is right there, good colleague. And we came up with this whole process for how do we do collaborative work, or work we call science with society. And so we identified the different steps. And then again, we wanted to do a survey and say, you know, for those people who have done collaborative work, you know, what works and what doesn't work. And all these steps in this process, we have 7 different steps here. Did people follow these steps? Were they helpful? And which of these steps, what activities within these steps were most valuable? Again, I don't have time to tell you all the details about this. And this was actually, we surveyed not just people working in mountains, but working all over in all different systems on collaborative projects, because we just wanted to understand, if the process was different in mountains or not mountains. And again, I'm just going to show you a few findings. And so for doing this kind of collaborative work where science is working with society to solve its problems, you might not be surprised, but we found that things like being flexible, having respect for different types of people involved in the process, having what is called a collaborative spirit. These were some of the most important characteristics for conducting collaborative work. Some of the problems were it takes a lot of time to establish the types of relationships to really do collaborative, impactful work on the ground. Often you have these weird power dynamics, like people maybe from the Western world or the US might feel like there's more economic power when they're working with community members in Nepal, for example. And so how can people be on equal footing when they're trying to solve problems? So this might be relevant to you all also. When people talked about their most successful projects, people felt that their project success was related to having high policy impact. So we had a lot of different ways that they might see the success of the project, and most people felt project success was related to policy impact. And then one final finding from this work, we looked at projects where researchers initiated the projects, where a stakeholder initiated the project, or where both researchers and stakeholders jointly initiated the project. And we found that for projects that actually had a high policy impact, they weren't initiated by researchers, rather they were initiated by practitioners, people on the ground. So I think that's really interesting for people like us who are in academia and want to have an impact. You know, we should be more responding to projects initiated by those on the ground rather than initiating themselves. So when I talk about our group, again, we're the Mountain Sentinels network. This is just a screenshot from our website, but I would encourage you, if you're interested in mountains and some of the work we're doing, to go to this website. You can sign up for our newsletter. And we have different events going on. This Friday, for example, at 9 in the morning, we have a webinar. We call it Virtual Coffee. And the topic is experiences of marginalization in the mountains, and how can efforts of decolonization and reconciling knowledge advance mountain futures? So thinking again about different knowledge systems and different roles that people play in addressing sustainability challenges in mountains. We have a fellows program, so you can get involved in a lot of different ways. We're always looking to expand. We have Twitter, Instagram. And so again, you can see that mountains really, in terms of climate change, in terms of water, in terms of governance, in terms of equity, there are a lot of ways in which the Sustainable Development Goals really directly intersect with mountain issues and solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klein, for that fantastic presentation, and thank you, Dr. Naupari, for yours as well. We will move on to the questions and discussions. I think the best approach would be to do a back and forth. So we'll start with Dr. Naupari and then move on to a question for Dr. Klein, back to Dr. Naupari, and so forth. Okay. So if anyone has questions, please post them in the chat. I see some people that already. For future questions, just write who you're asking, or if you're asking both, that way we can delegate it to the correct presenter. So Zach, I see you asked a question first. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Awesome. So Javier, yeah, I was going to say last summer I actually traveled to Peru. I spent 3 weeks mountaineering in the Ashinka Valley in Huascarán National Park, and I noticed that in Huascaran and in there is a lot of environmental and outside tourism, and I was wondering kind of how does outside tourism and that like land use of trails and all that stuff impact not only the rangeland health, but also how will climate change impact that form of tourism in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Yeah, well, regarding impacts on directly on rangelands, I doubt that there's some related impact to rangeland condition due to tourism, because it's mainly tracks that go across maybe those areas that are where people go may have some impact, but not on the rangelands where animals graze. No, even in some areas there's some llama tracking that goes with the tourism. I don't know if you saw those llamas and that carry the package. And climate change, yeah, we will have a high impact. And in the last 40 years or so, there's in that specific area, I don't remember the numbers, but my best guess is that 27% of those mountains lost the glaciers. But that's bad not only for tourism, but also for water issues that Julia just mentioned. No? And I forgot to mention that, for example, for Peru, 70% of population lives in coastal areas. No? That depends on the water that comes from those areas. So it's not only a problem with for tourism because of landscape, the beauty of those areas that could influence tourism, but also water. I guess it's more important for us. But people is very creative. If you go to Huaraz, then there's some tourism routes to see climate change impacts. There's a Pastoruri peak where people used to went down with snow.
Like skis?
Skis or something, yeah. And then there's no snow now. So, but and then people just figured out to show people what is the impact of climate change. So they show pictures and they bring people there, just to see the impacts.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Amna, I see you have a question for Dr. Klein. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi, thank you. That was a very cool presentation from the both of you. I just needed that picture that you showed, Dr. Klein. Initially, it seemed like a review sort of figure. So I just was wondering if we could get that paper, but then Sarah posted it in the chat.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And did you also mention something about political conflict?
I was thinking from the concept of my country in Pakistan, where there's so much conflict there, especially in the mountains that are on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan and India. So that's why we don't have any research going on in those areas at all. So
Yes, yeah, I was in the Karakoram many years ago. It's just an incredibly spectacular place. I just read an article. You're right. Conflict is really important. So I have colleagues that work in Cameroon and Congo, and one of the big ecosystem services of the forest in the mountain is just protection from conflict. Basically, people go and can hide in the forest, and that's a critical ecosystem service that we in the U.S. don't necessarily think of, right? And I just read an article there at the Indian-China border right now. There was I don't know if he was, the article said he was Chinese. I don't know if he was Tibetan or Chinese, but he was arrested because he went into India. He was helping someone, a yak had gone over the border into India, and then this individual was arrested because again of the conflict, the political conflict. So it's interesting. A lot of mountains are at political borders, so there is a lot of conflict, as you mentioned, with Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then people sometimes move into the mountains to escape conflict. And what we're seeing now with COVID is really fascinating because people are seeking refuge in the mountains to avoid disease from COVID and to get away. Like in the US, we have schools in places like Aspen, Colorado, seeing 3 times normal enrollment because people are moving outside of New York City and going to Aspen. And I have heard, Dr. Naupari, I don't, but in like Peru, people who are from the mountains have left places like Lima to go back to kind of their mountain roots and back to the agriculture there, kind of seeking refuge. So yeah, mountain spaces are very, very utilized in really, really different ways.
Interesting. I didn't know that about COVID, but that's very fascinating. Okay, so another question for Javier. Paula, are you still on the call?
Yes.
Okay, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, of course. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paula Lopez, and I study at National Agrarian University. So, Dr. Naupari, my question was about how can grazing can affect these peatlands or bofedales, because as far as I know, these cows and many other animals in highlands are bred in they are under extensive breeding, so they can eat from wherever, and maybe this could be impacting on bofedales. So what can we do to make these both activities coexist?
Okay. Thanks, Paula. Well, in these bofedales of peatlands, no, so there are different types also of these wetlands, no. So most of them are peatlands, and if we go to the southern part of Peru, is basically grazed by alpacas. But in Huascarán, where we are conducting our research, it's mostly cattle, no, and in some areas probably sheep, but mostly cattle. And cattle, because of their hoof, no, they can make this it's not overgrazed, but mostly damage the structure of the peatland, no? And people in that area or in other areas, they drain those bofedales or peatlands because they know that this damage their animals. And you can see also some skeletons of those animals that were stuck in those areas, no? So it's mainly the impact of the hoof, the weight of the animals, for example, cattle. But for alpacas, no, alpacas is different because alpacas are much lighter in weight, and they have also their teeth, no, in this area is like a knife, no, is cut the grasses, or in this case the pseudo grasses, no, basically the stichia, no, and it doesn't damage the bofedales, but it's mostly cattle and people that train those bofedales, no, for their animals not to be stuck, you know. So that's probably, I don't know if that answers your question, but basically that's mostly it, you know, for those ecosystem types.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I see a student from the SDG 13 group, Katiana, has a question for Julia. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Okay, sorry, I didn't find my mic. Now I'm having some trouble with my internet, so I cannot share my camera, but I will introduce myself. Hi, my name is Katiana. I'm from La Molina University in Peru, and my question is, which adaptation measures can be done in mountain ecosystem? I ask this because currently in Peru, there is a study going on that is doing a national adaptation plan for the whole country. And as far as I know, I didn't see like something or information about mountains ecosystems. So I would like to know if you know which adaptation measure has been done in other countries, maybe.
Sure, that's a great question. So I would say there are a lot of different adaptations, and they're very, in some ways, you know, it really depends on local context. So while we made some broad generalizations about mountains and see where things are operating and not, I think at the scale of adaptation, there is, you know, an important local component. But so for example, like on the Tibetan Plateau, what we found actually in our research was that the policy that's encouraging fencing to occur, and there's policy there that's encouraging people to stop moving their livestock so much, and you know, that is really bad for the rangelands, especially when it combines with climate change effects on the rangelands. And so being able to move the animals around and in a kind of a communal managed fashion is one way, for example, that can facilitate adaptation. In the, say, Western US here, where we're seeing a lot of fire with climate change, we're also seeing that you know, managing fire better. So our policy has been just to suppress fires for decades. And we're actually seeing that some of the indigenous practices of fire management actually would be more conducive for preventing huge fires that are going to become more prevalent with climate change. So another adaptation practice is forest management, and some of which would be more reminiscent of you know, native practices. And there's also, I've just read something from the Andes where, and I know the Mountain Institute is working on this, where some of, going back to some of the pre-Incan canal systems have been shown to help distribute the water and store water in the dry season and make it more available for a longer period of time. And so there are some projects really fascinating in Peru that are, again, kind of resurrecting these old, kind of really ancient water systems and finding that they're quite advanced and can help adapt to climate change, drier conditions that we'll see under climate change.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. So just to be aware and respectful of time, we have a few more minutes left. So I would like Ursula from SDG 13 to ask her question, because I believe it can be applicable to both presentations. So I would like both of you to respond to it, and then I think that is a good note to end on. Sorry that I wasn't able to get to all of the questions. There were some very good questions in here. Ursula, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Well, basically, I wanted to ask well, to both of the presenters. For the thing that you mentioned, Klein, Dr. Klein, there have been a really like amazing projects, what I've heard about, like water harvesting, and these are like ancient practices, right? So I wanted to know if there have been like huge programs here in Peru. I don't know about it, to avoid the loss of water because of climate change, and if this water harvesting is really can make like a huge difference in our country.
Julia, you are mute.
That's so funny. I keep doing that. That's a great question. So I think your question, I don't know that those projects that I referred to have happened on like a really large scale at the moment, but Dr. Naupari might have some better insight into that. I was looking at the chat, right? So with the melting glaciers, we are seeing lakes levels increasing and new lakes being formed in areas where lakes were not previously existing at all. And we're seeing that in, say, Peru and the Andes, and also in places like Nepal and the Himalayas. And so in a temporary sense, there's kind of more water available, but in the long term, that will lead to drying. And then there's also concern that some of those lakes, that those moraines are not stable. And there are people living downstream of those lakes. And so there's, again, both the Himalayas and the Andes have these threats from GLOFs, or glacial lake outburst floods, that are pretty dangerous and of concern to people. But yeah, I'll let.
Okay, sorry. Yes, well, regarding the experience of these ancient channels, I was part of that research with the Mountain Institute. That's a project of ecosystem-based assessment. No? That's the project that they conducted, and there, in the team there were archaeologists, no? And they found these channels, and they recuperate those channels, especially for dry season, no? And mainly for watering rangelands, but also for watering livestock, because this area during the dry season was not used by livestock. But when they open these channels, or they reconstruct or repair those channels, then producers were able to brought their animals there and graze during the dry season, because now they have water. But that's that's the case that I know of. It's not in a large scale yet project, but the Ministry of Agriculture has this program that is called probably it's Ministry of Environment, don't remember well, but it's the Sierra Azul program. It's like a Blue Sierra program, you know, where they are trying to recuperate these water bodies, you know? And as Dr. Juliet mentioned, now we have water, but that won't be that won't be forever, no? And so they are trying to make these cochas, no? That they was what we call here cochas, these water bodies, to recuperate this water that is coming from mountains, no? And the Ministry of Agriculture is also for years now. We have now a livestock division in the Ministry of Agriculture that are trying to recuperate grasslands. No, they have some. So from those poor condition rangelands that I showed, at least 200,000 hectares of those is the plan to recover by 2027. No, and well, that could help also to capture, no, hopefully water, no, and to infiltrate that into the soil, no, and those are the two projects that I know of so far by the national government.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So Macy, this is Gillian, if I could jump in for a hot second.
Yeah, of course.
Just wanted to say two things because these are important. So for the SDG teams to think about a lot of what's being discussed are issues of glacial outbursts that ties to biodiversity changes and biodiversity changes at multiple levels. But I also wanted to highlight one third thing that Javier and myself and others have been working on for some years, is that when the glaciers retreat, they don't retreat cleanly, so to speak. They leave behind exposed rock, and a lot of that exposed rock has very heavy iron oxides. So you end up with lakes, but you also end up with streams that have a pH of around 3, which also kills most of the biodiversity in those waterways. So it's a complicated process, not just the glaciers retreating, leaving nice, clean, what we call clear water lakes. You often get these lakes that are heavily polluted, that look like a mining operation, but it's actually just the glaciers outgassing and outweathering of rocks, and it kills all the fish, and also kills most of the aquatic invertebrates. So it's just a complicated question to think about when we look at life underwater and life on land. Both of those are tied very closely to the glacier retreat, and also it ties to climate action by the Peruvian government trying to address a glacial retreat question, very closely tied with food security, because of this issue of the cattle survival in this area. So for all these SDG teams, it's a good chance to look at the linkages in the mountain systems to have a spectacular way of thinking about linkages. And then the last thought before, and first I want to make sure we all give it a moment to thank, maybe if everybody could turn their screen on for a hot second, if you're able, and let's give a nice round of applause, and thank our speakers. Greatly appreciate you guys coming in, and having our students sort of think about some of the complexity, but also hearing from the students of La Molina itself, sharing their questions about mountain systems and how we can work together. So think about that in your SDG teams as ways to think about projects to do. The interlinkages of some of these projects will cross, and mountains, as Julia presented, is a wonderful way to think about crossing so many SDGs. You probably be hard pressed to find an SDG that doesn't have a mountain in it somewhere, if you want to think about it that way, because even the underwater mountains, you can't even leave out the ocean. So I think that's again, thank you to our guest speakers, and thanks so much for sharing. Thank you for hosting thing. Macy doing a spectacular job of moderating. We're going to give you a round of applause too, and thanks to Macy and the team for coming up with great questions. Last reminder to everyone, please do continue to post your questions. The SDG team in charge will collect the questions and get them to Javier and to Julia to answer the questions.